Sharka, Dr. Parth, Dr. Chakraborty. I think, and thank you very much, Shamrat, for inviting me. Shamrat is a long-time collaborator who has actually participated in the Critical Posthumanism project in the book that Dr. Charkar just mentioned. So thank you. It's my pleasure to be part of this discussion series. My talk is called Reorienting a Post-Humanist Orient in the Co-Constitution of the Humanities and Technology. I will read my paper and afterwards we can enter into a discussion. I would like first to start by unpacking my title in its terms and relations. To reorient is to orient once again. I'll come to this repetition at the end of my discussion, but to orient is to locate and direct. The term is related to the rising sun and to the east. It brings to mind ancient rituals of sun salutation and circumambulation, but thinking of historical traces closer to our times, it reminds us of the voyages of discovery of 16th century Europe, a turning to the east, as it were, for an expansive movement of the will to knowledge, but more insidiously behind it for the will to power, for the possession, enjoyment, and exploitation of colonialism. It reminds us of the nautical compass, an emblem of technology, and the journeys glorified and mythologized in the West, which were really a hunt for gold. Let us remember that Christopher Columbus went west in search of India in a ship named the Golden Hind and named the people he found Indians, a misnomer that stuck for 5 centuries and is still in use by a large number of people today. One may thus say that the orientation of 16th century Europeans created their own Orient, however they saw it. This brings us to the Orient in the title and to its qualifier, post-humanist. Post-humanism is a contemporary term and refers to a historical overpassing of humanism. This is not necessarily the human, but the ism or ideology by which the human is defined. Indeed, this term can be traced in its present sense to the same orienting epoch of the 16th century, which itself was really a reorientation from its prior trajectory and a return to a previous one, hence a new birth or renaissance. The European Renaissance can be thought of synonymously with humanism, as it was a reorientation from a centering in the institutionalized God of the Christian Church to the discovery of the human as the source of knowledge and achievement, a return to the philosophical and cultural humanism of Hellenic or classical Greece. Aristotle's definition of the human as a unique conjunction of rational and animal souls, or with the feeling function of the animal rationalized by conjunction with reason, came to occupy the center of a new epoch of discovery, as imaged by Leonardo da Vinci in his Vitruvian Man. Within a couple of centuries, however, this definition saw some orienting shifts by a variety of means, a major influence being the philosophy of deism, which held that God had endowed man with his own creative faculty, reason, so that he could complete the work of rationally perfecting the world that God had left unfinished. This shifted the definition of the human to a quasi-divine rationality, an ordering intelligence whose place on earth was to know the laws that made all things predictable in the image of a clockwork universe. The subordination of the sensible to the rational inaugurated one of the most foundational binaries that characterize our understanding in this human understanding of the human in this age, the age of the Enlightenment. It is with us still, which is partly why it informs our discussion of the humanities today. This shift in the idea of the human in the Enlightenment cannot be overemphasized. Though the image of a clockwork universe saw a good deal of nuancing, particularly by thinkers such as Immanuel Kant, the idea of reason as the essence of the human, by the application of which both the who and the what, subject and object, would yield up their secrets and lead to a perfect world, is the systemic and systematic turn constituting the epistemological project which characterizes our time, ever since the Enlightenment, a project immanent in the modern knowledge academy that is ubiquitous and to which we are all yoked by dint of being born in this age. Though the form of the modern university as we know it now comes from the 19th century, its roots are in the Renaissance and more properly the European Enlightenment. Behind it is the faith that total or absolute knowledge is the birthright and within the grasp of the human of humanism, whose rationality penetrates his animality and all materiality to become the knower to whom the world belongs. We started with the orienting drive of the voyages of discovery and saw how their so-called epistemological nobility was a cover for the will to power as colonialism, the possession, domination, and exploitation of the non-West. This surreptitious aim of power was ubiquitous to the systematic epistemological project of the modern knowledge academy, something that has made many contemporary thinkers view colonialism as the very heart of modernity. Even in our post-colonial age, it is characterized by Jürgen Habermas as a colonization of the life world. But truly, far more pervasive, it is a geopolitics, biopolitics, and psychopolitics that unleashes an order of thanatopolitics, a binary of life and death based on who gets to be admitted into the club of the human, the master of the neo-colonial, neoliberal, global, non-human world. The absolute hubris, the binaries and privileges of the modern knowledge academy are implicit from its early beginnings in its recognition of the curious imbalance between its infinite ambition and the finite lives of its workers in the choice of its systematic methods. System in the academy manifests itself in three major categories: disciplinarity of subject categories, methodicity in research, and standards of protocol in archiving. These are meant to make sure that a body of accumulated knowledge develops that is impersonal and universal, so that anyone at any time and anywhere may enter it to add or utilize it. Of these systemic devices, what concerns us particularly here is disciplinarity, the classification of subject areas into a tree structure with potentially infinite specialized leaves, with the assumption of an additive integration, developing total knowledge at some vanishing point. This model brings to light the ubiquitous nature of arboretic classification in modernity, a paradigm characteristic of rational knowledge, due to its ontology of non-exclusive discreteness and derivative arrangement. These two factors, A, that in a scheme, any identifiable location is unique and non-interchangeable, and B, that locations are structured according to fixed assignable ancestries, are at the very heart of the ordering mechanism of modernity. Whether we understand order in terms of knowledge or power, that is, of epistemology, the order of the world, or coloniality and governmentality, the lines of ordering populations and activities, as in commanding them. The first of these two implies an identification of essences, and the second, that of priorities. The very first distinction one may think of here is between the who and the what, the subject and the object. In terms of knowledge, the humanities and the human sciences against the material sciences, earth sciences, and life sciences forming the pure sciences, and technologies forming the applied sciences. As we have seen, however, however much the pretension to knowledge of the Renaissance may have privileged the subject and the study of the humanities, philosophy and theology, and the pure sciences, with the progress of the Enlightenment, the will to power as the driver of the will to knowledge became gradually more overt, leading to a privileging of the sciences over the humanities and of technology over the pure sciences as the age proceeded. This is particularly so in the case of the university at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, with the image of the ordered field of knowledge and of society and politics having little need for it for the arts of a philosophy. We have yet to think of the post-human, but let us turn to the Orient, as those who oriented themselves towards it did. We have noted that they did so for the purposes of possession and exploitation, as in colonialism. But the matter is not as simple as that. The Enlightenment definition of the human as a rational being is not something that colonialism could shake off so easily. This definition is, after all, extended universally to all humans and haunts the colonizing enterprise as the white man's burden. This is what constituted the conflicted heart of colonialism, the othering of non-Western populations that went hand in hand with the bestowal of universal humanity upon them. It was this conflict that was capitalized by Indian nationalists, for example. We are quite familiar with Gandhi's hunger fasts and rhetoric that played upon the conscience of the British. Yet, while colonialism lasted, the white man's burden had to be accompanied with other arguments that could stop short from accepting the full humanity of the native. As Edward Said pointed out in 1978, Orientalism was one of these arguments, a backhanded compliment that constructed the Orient as the other of the Occident, contemplative, spiritual, imaginative, and fatalistic, in opposition to the rational, materialistic, and free-willing West. Of course, many of the Orientalists were projecting a romantic critique of Enlightenment modernity onto the East as its essence. But in doing so, they were helping to locate the Orient in the arboretic classification of Enlightenment racism and ethnocentrism as a different kind of and subordinate human, in Homi Bhabha's phrase, not quite, not white. Colonialism conjured nationalism as its own inverse in the arboretic position play of the mind. Though it would be simplistic to see only two positions of address within colonialism, there are several in between and at least one extreme, the refusal of humanity, apartheid. For our purposes, we can see how nationalism retorted with varieties of response that clustered around and polarized into a secular humanism and a religious essentialism. Again, this is not to suggest that the early response of cultural politics in Bengal that has been called the Bengal Renaissance can be reduced to religious essentialism, or that complex leaders such as Gandhi can be categorized simply in either response. But these were the polar positions into which the response crystallized over time and emerged in a post-colonial India. Today, 70 years after independence, we have learned that it is no longer necessary to define the human in terms of rationality, and that the identity politics of religious and ethnic essentialism can be a will to rationality, can be a will to power that needs no more rationality than colonialism as its justification to capture the science and technology to order its own mythological world. Moreover, it is neither the only nor the first to do so. Right-wing nationalism is rising undisguisedly all around us, a sign of the bankruptcy of Enlightenment humanism and a form of post-humanism, or perhaps alter-humanism. The will to power, as with the reorientation of the voyages of discovery we started with, was never primarily interested in knowledge, except as it served the purposes of power and possession or consumption. In other words, of political hegemony and of capital. Technology, as with shipbuilding and the maritime compass, served this purpose, as did the science of administration and management. But what these applied orders of rationality served were the delirious fantasies of absolute power and enjoyment. Returning now to disciplinarity and the last part of my title, from the early 20th century, the split between the humanities and the sciences and technologies grew increasingly into an unbridgeable gulf. Technology, more and more directly the handmaiden of capital in a colonial and industrial political economy, with the humanities in a precarious position, either as part of the justificatory machinery of this economy or integrated into it as its pleasure industries. Embedded within an institutional complex of publishing houses, educational institutions, museums, critics, advertising, speculation, collection, and consumption, all dependent on capital or political patronage for support, humanities in the modern world found itself cornered, a compromised guest in a foreign territory. Its place of independence with regard to the spiritual life, the life of creative expression, of human conscience, or of the definition of the human was swept under the carpet. Philosophy reduced to natural philosophy, today better known as science. This divide between the humanities and science was recognized by C.P. Snow in his famous essay, The Two Cultures. But in that essay, he was not clear about the reasons for the peripheral and alienated place of the humanities in our times, or about what has led to the necessity of its politicization against the hegemonic regime of capital and its instrumentalization of the human. As a world phenomenon, from the early 20th century, the humanities have largely rejected mainstream populations to focus, on the one hand, on experimental expressions of subjectivity, and on the other, on political responses to the dehumanization and social injustices of our times. The first of these directions, an experimental subjective precision in expression, gave a sense of renewed purpose and spiritual realism to modernism in the early decades of the last century. But the shadow of gloom that spread across the world from the Second World War on has plunged the humanities into an age of cynicism and absurdism, in which a nomad politics of the periphery against the regime of capital is the only way the human spirit has kept itself alive in an isolated culture. It is almost a given in our times of pervasive cyber technology that it is technology that makes us human. An average person of our time carries a sense of superiority with respect to history due to the intuition of advanced technology which marks our time. We live in a time when our mediating ontology is technological. We live within a new medium, a cyber virtuality, which we take for granted, just like the air we breathe. At the same time, we are increasingly prostheticized and implanted with technology so that it exists inside and outside us. Very soon, if we go by the predictions of the transhumanists, the technological medium will have disappeared into us, and we will disappear into the technological medium. Is this the fulfillment of the humanist phase, its supersession, or its obsolescence? Clearly, we are at a frontier of history when the humanist image of the human, to quote Michel Foucault, is a face in the sand being swiftly erased by the incoming tide. Yet, it is nationalist ideology and consumerist technology that drive the levers effecting this erasure. It is neoliberal globalization and ideological mythology that instrumentalize us and virtualize us and our world. Their objectives profile and target us from within and without, giving us our packaged and franchised dreams and turning us into passionate subjects willing to fight for them as for ourselves. When we seem most free, we are most bound by the internalized technologies of what Gilles Deleuze called the controlled societies of our time. Our critical faculty faces obsolescence in this tide, and the fire that perhaps truly makes us human is no longer ours, parasited by ideology and capital. In Nietzsche's view, as expressed in Thus Spake Zarathustra, this is the image of the last man, expressing the will to nihilism, the destruction of the true forces of life. What makes us human, according to Nietzsche, is neither our rationality nor an essence of being that distinguishes us, whether a species essence or a racial, ethnic, or religious essence. It is the will to power over our own limitations. It is the will to becoming greater than ourselves, equal to the gods. Though it is not clear if in Nietzsche, who is so full of disdain towards Christian pity, whether this becoming greater is also a becoming larger, more inclusive, it is important for us to heed his message and apply a constructive hermeneutic to its understanding, as done by Deleuze and Guattari. A will to become other, applied to the global problems of our time, can include a becoming minor, becoming animal, becoming earth, becoming cosmos. In heeding this message, we find that Nietzsche's definition of the human as a structure of becoming is indeed a reorientation, as it comes from the mouth of an Oriental, the Persian prophet Zoroaster. A constructive hermeneutic of this kind can find a similar message for the human emanating from ancient India. In the Shatapatha Brahmana, chapter 13:6, Narayana is a seer or rishi who conceives of an aspiration of becoming all that is in the cosmos and all that is beyond the cosmos. He thus defines the scope of the human as a will to becoming that is radically infinite. In modern times, this finds expression in a major figure of the Bengal Renaissance, Aurobindo Ghosh, also known as Sri Aurobindo. Quote, "Thought is not essential to existence nor its cause, but it is an instrument for becoming. I become what I see in myself. All that thought suggests to me, I can do. All that thought reveals in me, I can become. This should be man's unshakable faith in himself, because God dwells in him." Unquote. This is much more than a tenet of positive thinking. It is the tenet of becoming other, not of having more, or becoming or social becoming, which is only another kind of having, occupying a position in a static order of being maintained by the regime of our present ontology. Becoming other implies a different kind of psychology than the rational individualism of the cogito in Descartes or Kant or the bounded ego of Freud. We have to think of other models of psychology and ontology, such as Deleuze's virtuality or plane of immanence, or of impersonal planes of consciousness in Indian psychology with which the individual could identify. In the work of Michel Foucault, it is this will to becoming that has been stolen from the human by the state, by capital, and by religion. They implant their goals of being and having in us in the form of conscience, through what Freud called the superego, or Lacan the phallocentric figure of the father. They discipline us through technologies of surveillance, confession, and punishment on the one hand, and by the pleasure industries supported by technologies of desire production on the other. The recovery of the will to becoming is the first need of the human in our times, a post-humanist redefinition or reorientation of the human. Michel Foucault sees this as a project of inverting the technologies of capital and ideology, replacing them with the subjective technologies of soul-making. A post-humanist Orient can contribute and participate in this need of our times through a constructive hermeneutics of the cultural archives of becoming cosmic, held, for example, in the history of Indian philosophies, psychologies, and cultures. The subjectivity of such a reorientation of the human opens up a new scope for the humanities in our place and time. And what of technology and its stranglehold on us today? Technology as an instrument of the human domination of the cosmos has brought us to our present moment of greatest triumph, which is at the same time our moment of greatest impotence in the face of an ecosystem we have shattered. But even as huge cracks appear on the freeways of capital, its agents, oblivious of their presence, continue to advance its integrated technologies and sophisticated systems at the service of profit-making, production, and consumption on the one hand, and political ideologies on the other. However, in a post-COVID world, the failures of our civilization will continue to grow more apparent alongside our desperate patchwork attempts to stem the tide of dystopia. New contested borderlands will appear for those who seek new definitions of the human and new relations with the world. We have already seen in the late work of Michel Foucault that the will to power turned into a will to becoming inverts the social technologies of subjection to the subjective technologies of soul making. With this inversion, we can develop a new understanding of external technologies as well, as theorized by thinkers such as Gilbert Simondon and Bernard Stiegler. Extending our technologies from the inside out, we can see our external technologies as an extended organology. Contemporary media technologies are materializing human cultural history into a contemporary spatiality. Stiegler is particularly concerned with the archives of cultural memory that are all around us in and as technology and available to us as a tertiary form of universal memory that can be manipulated from the outside by the forces of capital and ideology, but that can, if we recover our will to becoming, be the circuits of long-term memory, shared, reinterpreted, and participated in by communities of collective transindividuation, building the polis of another kind of post-humanist future. Transindividuation is not a collection of individuals bound by a social contract and governed from above by laws. It is not even intersubjectivity. It is a will to conscious collective individuality, a braiding of individuations into a collective individual, conscious of itself in all its individuals. Such communities imply a different political economy, one of fraternal anarchism. A participatory community of this kind, with porous goals of becoming, can be constituted by shared genealogies of collective memory, materialized by technologies and interpreted by the humanities. Technology, seen in this light, is no longer an alienated antagonist of the humanities, not even a form in which the humanities can reside as content, but as co-constituents of our collective ontology, or rather ontogenesis, as psychologically part of us and as instrumental to our humanities as our personal memory, perpetually stored and perpetually reinterpreted in our collective participation in a trans-individuating cosmogenesis. Thank you.
Thank you, Devashish. Pavel, please, can you make us visible? Yeah. Pavel, are you there? Please make us visible. Thank you, Devashish. Like, there are one or two questions, but I want to ask you some things. We can start the. Yeah, Pavel, are you there? Please, can you make us visible, all of us? Yeah. Uh, like I have some questions for you, uh, like certain queries, certain clarifications. Uh, First is, since you talked about science and technology, uh, you know, within the discourse of science itself, there is this dialectics of knowing and unknowability at work. This
Yes.
dialectics of knowing and unknowability is within the discourse of science, and but it is we humans who have reduced this dialectics of uh, like dialectics within the science into a kind of scientism which essentializes uh, scientific knowledge and fetishizes scientific knowledge as an absolute truth. I want to ask this question, that how this uh, very fetishization of science as hard truth, as absolute truth, uh, is connected with the fetish of the digital and the capitalist fetishization of science and technology in the modern world. So that is one question. Well, you can what you'd like, should I ask 2 3 questions and then
Yeah,
you'll
yes,
respond?
Comrade. Yeah, please ask 2 3 questions.
Yeah. Uh, so another question is, mm, like, uh, do you think that this post-human future, though you have already partly answered this question, still I would like to ask that, do you think the roots of this post-human future, uh, which we are seeing now, existed as the alienated other of the human in humanism? That is another question. And what do you think? This is something which interests me a lot. What do you think? You talked about control society, so I want to ask you, what do you think about the control of the algorithm today? Like I was sharing the posters of this seminar repeatedly, and someone asked me that, why are you sharing the same thing again and again? So I said, okay, this is all about algorithm. This is the same way that the right wing IT cells they work. They share the same thing again and again, and it continuously comes in your news feed. So I'm trying to use that in a positive purpose, so that people can know about this lecture and listen. So what is the control of algorithm? You talked about uh, psychopolitics, and collected to this psychopolitics is this politics of algorithm, which is affecting our idea of truth and reality in a certain sense. And also, it is pertinent in a world of what we call post-truth. These are some of the questions, and then I can ask 1 or 2 questions from the audience response. Please.
Yes, Comrade. Absolutely, very pertinent questions. Um, I, I think you might mute your mic, or somebody might need to mute mic. Yes. So, your first question about the discourse of knowability and unknowability within science itself is very true, and philosophy of science has dealt with that. That is the way in which science has developed as a discourse. But also, you're absolutely right, and that has actually happened due to the privileging of technology. We come back to the whole idea of the will to knowledge and the will to power. The will to power drives the will to knowledge and actually creates this alienated fetish objects of technology. Technology becomes fetishized because the libido is really captured through this idea of a certain kind of a bounded knowledge which is true, the truth knowledge of science. And that becomes attached or associated with technology. Technology drives that notion that what we are being given is the truth, so that that particular reified knowledge is really what we receive as the kind of illusion of our reality. See, So that, in a sense, is how we lead our lives, how we are made to lead our lives, rather than entering into the discourse of science as a philosophy that is related to the will to knowledge. So I think it's really this separation of the will to knowledge and the will to power in our times that has led to this ontology of our social ontology of our times. The other question that you had about post-humanism as being the other of the human is also absolutely true. That is that in a way, humanism defines the human again like that in a discourse that shifts. And in that shifting, it is othering its own other possibilities. And at the same time, those possibilities live within it and become into a transhumanism. It becomes into a privileging of the technological post-human, you see. But at the same time, we have the other subjugated discourses of knowledge within humanism, which is what Foucault is talking about. He calls it the insurrection of subjugated knowledge. And that is really the subjugation of humanism, which returns as post-humanism in our times. Finally, your question related to algorithm or the controlled societies. Actually, controlled societies are largely dependent on algorithms. Algorithms are driving us from outside as well as from inside. And we are subject to them, so that even when we think we are free, that is what is controlling our thoughts. And what you were saying about the inversion of algorithmic life, which is that, when I'm talking about a kind of an inversion of humanism into a post-humanism of becoming, even such a post-humanism of becoming has to be in relation with the ontology of our times. And therefore, it has to utilize the same tropes of that ontology to find its, economic foothold. And as you were saying, you have to utilize the algorithmic nature of, of the machine, that the technology whose ontology we live in. So I think this is the way in which controlled societies work. We need to be conscious of it, but we can also use it to beneficial purpose for the politics of our times.
Thank you, Devashishda. Another interesting question. I think it will be very relevant to your talk, because you talked about certain kind of technological overdetermination to be overhauled and overcome by a resurgence of the minor knowledges which can effectively come through technology in a certain way. And you talked about another kind of the post-human possibilities, where we are also a part of the life world. I thank you for using this word, life world. I was reading Derrida's take on life world a few days back, and this. But I was just asking you this idea of the infinite to which man is implicated, and man's ability to connect with the infinite, which you referred through Bengal Renaissance figure like Aurobindo and maybe Tagore also in certain sense, Rabindranath. I was asking you how this infinite is appropriated in certain ways in a certain discourse of technology, because technology offers you a certain kind of false infinite where everything is flattened, all knowledges are appropriated and absorbed into a certain kind of false, I would say still pseudo singularity. And this, what the problem with this is that a connected question is that how this opens us up to a certain kind of continuous fulfillment of the desire for the infinite through a certain consumerist capitalist technology, and on the other hand, exposing you to a certain kind of precarity, because you know that all your individuation is erased by a grand representation of infinite to which you cannot connect, but rather which connects to you. So this dialectics of precarity and consumerism and the kind of myth of the technological infinite is in certain sense also responsible for the rise of the right-wing politics. So how you'd address this? Thank you.
Yes, Shamrat, that is, I think, extremely penetrating analysis, very, very true. And it's exactly what we are in the middle of, the fact of this, displacement of the infinite into the flattened technological consumerism of our times, and also in a way to the discourse of the transhuman. The transhuman offers us another kind of infinite, which is also a type of surrogate flattening, because again we come back to the whole idea of the will to power, which has become, in a way, which has been stolen from us, which has become externalized through these ontologies that govern us and control us. And it is really an inversion of that, and only an inversion of that. Stiegler talks about how the libido has been really, destroyed by this kind of a false infinite, instead of which he's talking about the infinite sublimation of the libido in forming goals of becoming, which are infinite. And so it's this inversion that is necessary. And until we understand that, we will be subject to it. And this is what is happening all around us. We are being subject to it, and we are falling into easy subjection, because in a way we are thinking that something infinite is being given to us. So it's a real, it's a trap. And the trap can only be, understood and addressed by an inversion, where the inversion goes towards a goal of becoming rather than the goal of having and of occupying social positions.
Thank you. Now I will ask, I think we have 5-7 minutes for questions. So before we start with Anirbandha, because we started late also, I just read some of the questions. Pavel, can you please highlight just the questions? I can read it from the last question. That will be beneficial for you. I'll read the last question first, and then we can proceed. Like 2-3 questions, so that Debashishda can see it on the screen as well. The last question by Ashok Mahapatra, Professor Ashok Mahapatra. He teaches at Shambhalpur University and very interested in posthumanism. The avid reader of posthumanism also. He has asked a question: how would you react to the concept of infinity as postulated by Levinas, who wanted to develop an alternative ontology?
So
this is one question.
I'm not so familiar with the concept of infinity as postulated by Levinas, who was, an ethical thinker. I'm not that aware of his concept of infinity. I'm sorry. So I don't think, I think I'll bypass that question.
Thank you, Debashishda. I think Ashokda can later on engage with you with this question. Alicia Gonzalez, she has asked a question: is there a way for the humanities to actualize the will to power over their current limitations, peripheral orientations, to spur posthumanism? What would that look like?
Yes, indeed. I believe that is possible, and I believe that is what the role of the humanities today can be. And that's what I said about the fact that the humanities can really promote this idea of becoming, the idea of the literatures of becoming, the cultures of becoming, and the cultures of actually today in the arts, for example, we don't think about metaphors as much as metonyms now. In other words, how do we construct our history in an interpretive sense? How do we become, willing subjects that are actually finding a path for ourselves, a genealogy for ourselves in a material way, in our connection with history? So the ability to allow people to engage with histories in the sense of developing genealogies of becoming is something that the humanities can promote.
Thank you. Thank you, Devashida. Next question is, I am not sure about it, but then where do you see the relevance of hierarchy with respect to the split? Not so much the power, but who wields it. I am not sure what the speaker.
Yeah, I believe she's talking about the hierarchy between the science, between the humanities and the technologies, and the question of who wields the power. So that's a very pertinent issue, and that really it sets us up for a kind of system where there's a scramble for power. The will to power really is a will to control, and the hierarchy between technology and humanities really sets us up for a competitive sort of system where everybody is trying to get hold of those levers of power. And that completely, we are in a war situation because of that. This is the nature of the universal war in which we find ourselves.
Thank you. There is a question. I want to ask this question. Just scroll up, Pavel, you will see a question by Shopna Rai. I think she is the first one to ask you a question. This, I think, will, because this is connected with Indian philosophy, I want to ask it first. What do you think? What do you think of artificial consciousness, AI, in context to the transcendental theory of consciousness of Advaita Vedanta? This question.
Well, artificial consciousness, or AI, is we are going back to things like transhumanism. In transhumanism, artificial consciousness, there is the notion that to some extent machine consciousness can arrive at human consciousness. Today, we don't really view it fully like that. We view it more in terms of artificial consciousness as implanted replacement. In other words, all
Hello, it's getting interrupted. Hello. Yeah, I don't know what is the problem. Hello. Hello. Pavel, please switch off everybody's mic except Devashishda. Let's see if we can listen. I know I'm not sure. কিছু শোনা যাচ্ছে না পাবেল, বুঝতে পারছি না কি হলো, সবাই বেরিয়ে গেল নাকি?
I think Professor Banerjee has left.
Oh, there must be some problem. Just let us wait for some time.
Some technical glitches might be. Some technical glitches might be.
Some technical glitches. Maybe he has left. Let me see the messenger. I hope he will rejoin because let us wait for a couple of minutes because I think he will rejoin. কি হলো বুঝলাম না, but I don't know what's going to happen. Like Professor Banerjee got disconnected, na? He has left somehow. So কি করব বুঝতে পারছি। হ্যাঁ, we can wait for then we can start.
Hello, can you
he's
hear
coming
me?
back. Right, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Devashish da, there was some problem, so you just left. Thank you for coming back. Please
Okay.
continue with your
This question is, you know, artificial consciousness with context to transcendental theory of consciousness of Advaita Vedanta. The artificial theory or artificial intelligence really belongs to the notion of transhumanism. In a philosophical sense, I'd say these are two extremes. One extreme, both extremes are not of much concern to a post-humanist ethic, because on the one hand, you are lost in the machine, and in the other hand, you're lost in the infinite or in the transcendental. The transcendental has no interest in us. And the machine, in the machine we lose ourselves. So both these extremes are, in a sense, you know, it's not even a post-humanism, it's an extra-humanism. So that is not really what concerns us in this particular discussion.
Thank you, Devashish da. I will not ask further questions. There are many more, but I'll request if Anirbanda has anything to ask to you. Anirbanda, Dr. Anirban Das is Associate Professor, Center for Studies in Social Sciences, our next speaker. Do you have anything to ask to Devashish da? You can.
Not at the moment. Like maybe when you talk there.
It is nice to see you after a long time.
It's nice to see and hear you.
Okay, then can I ask one last question? Like this is connected with like semiotics. Professor Oriktam Chatterjee, he has asked, sir, do you think semiotics holds the key for charting the field of post-humanist communication between humankind and technology? Like to answer this?
Yes, I will.
Semiotics?
Okay, yes, semiotics is the study of signification systems. And signification systems can help us up to a certain point. But I think, you know, as Deleuze points out, there is another kind of understanding of semiology, which has to do with signs that are not yet signified. You see, in our ability to communicate with, let's say, non-human, you know, we have to depend on something which is not yet a signification system. Therefore, semiotics, as we understand it, only goes up to a certain point. Beyond that, we have to develop another kind of understanding of sign. The sign that, in a sense, signals that the ideas that are not yet manifest. You see, we have to open to that kind of a sign understanding, which is really the domain of the post-human. I don't think that semiotics, as we understand it now, holds the key for charting the field of post-human communication between the human and technology. I think you have to go beyond semiotics.
Thank you, Devashish da. Thanks a lot. It was really an enlightening discussion.